In the 50s, people didn't look down upon nuclear power in the same intensity as they do today. For most Kiwis, nuclear power meant boundless energy, exciting new future for the whole of mankind, mineral wealth for those that possessed the resources. The potential wealth for New Zealand from a single site of uranium was put at £50 million in 1957. This at a time when New Zealand's standard of living was falling. What we were selling overseas was hardly diverse, and the country was tied by an umbilical cord to Britain, now a faltering superpower with its own economic issues to address. No one in NZ was going to object to everyone in the country becoming wealthy or ripping a small tracts of the countryside up. To put £55 million into today's terms, $55 in 2022 equated to roughly £1 in 1957. That works out to be roughly 27 billion Kiwi buckaroos. Hiroshima? Never heard of it. Plenty of people lose their hair and can't have kids. Rather than being banned like today, the government encouraged fossickers, offered rewards for fines and subsidised operations. The first wind the public and authorities got the country was possibly sitting on untold wealth began at this establishment. The Berlin's pub in the Gorge on the South Island's west coast. That was the pub in the 1950s. As a bit of publicity for the local tourist industry, and I don't make anything out of this, by the way. This is the pub and the cafe today. There's accommodation out the back. This I know because I've stayed there. Now we go back to 1955. Before I continue with the general gist, this wasn't the first time in both the official and unofficial capacities people went looking for commercial uranium deposits. In Ernest Marsden, New Zealand possessed one of the world's leading physicists of his generation. Marsden was a protege of another Ernie, Rutherford. Shortly after WW2, Marsden was given the task by the government to undertake a survey into what deposits of uranium the country had. This focused chiefly on the west coast, and the scope went as far as Fiordland and beach sands. The results were disappointing. No commercial value. Extracting uranium from the host rock is a costly business. A second major survey occurred 2 years later. That increased the scope to Nelson, Otago and Southland with the same disappointing results. American corporation Union Carbide came sniffing and went home empty-handed. Time for you now to get your bearings. A map of the South Island is on your left. Skip 10 years, and two hard-as-nails old miners, Frederick Casson and Charles Jacobson, rolled out of the Berlin's boozer one evening and headed back towards Westport. 10 kilometres down the road, Jacobson asked Casson to pull the truck over as he was dying for a piss. In the back of the truck was a Geiger counter, and the twosome decided to try their luck as there was no sign of traffic on the one-way stretch of road. The Geiger counter went crazy as it was placed close to the cliff next to the road. Fair question, what the hell were two old blokes doing with a Geiger counter? Given the potential riches that would come from a uranium find, the government had published a how-to pamphlet on what to look for and how to knock up a rudimentary Geiger counter for just 10 quid. As an interesting sideline, remember Ernest Marsden? Well, he had worked with Hans Geiger in Manchester, England between the years of 1908 and 1913. Between the two, they'd come up with this groundbreaking experiment. If my brain was bigger, I could tell you about it. The other thing that distinguishes the two coasters, apart from carrying a Geiger counter around like it was an umbrella, was their age. They weren't spring chickens. Both were in their 70s in November 1955. They weren't hanging around either. Off they went to Wellington on the next ferry and presented the rock to the government. Prime Minister Sidney Holland himself got his mitts on it. The excited press couldn't get enough of the two old blokes and their beeping Geiger counter. When they rather naively mentioned the spot it came from, half the country could have driven there blindfolded. Hawkes Crag. Even today, Hawkes Crag remains a distinct piece of highway beside the Buller Gorge. Whilst the two were showing off their pet rock to everyone from officials to the locals at the pub, meanwhile James Fair from down the road in Westport was lodging New Zealand's first uranium claim. Guess where? The hillside behind Hawkes Crag. So when the elderly twosome entered the very same office later that day, they found they were beaten to the gun. They were, however, in receipt of a cheque from the government as a finder's fee, £100, which if you multiply by 55 will tell you you have plenty of money to put across the bar at Mr. and Mrs. Clark's pub at Berlin's. The publicity had meant, for the first time in about a century, the couple had ran out of beer. Other sites on the west coast were soon discovered. The pamphlet on how to find and build your own Geiger counter had to be reprinted. Fit deer hunters, possum trappers and bushmen saw their opportunity to strike it rich in the remote back blocks. Interlopers from over the hill and weekend warriors also began bush bashing around Westland. AU fever was dropped for just plain U. 4 camps were set up in close proximity in and around Buller Gorge, and the government chipped in with the construction of roads and bush clearing. It was all on between 1955 and 1960. The British soon got wind and sent an expert out from their Atomic Energy Commission in 1957 to check out what all the fuss was all about. Between 59 and 60, the United Kingdom's Atomic Energy Authority entered into mining agreements with the Crown. It all ended in tears though, and concentrations of uranium oxide were continually found to be too low to be commercially viable. And that wasn't the end of it though. Nuclear power was still considered to be a complementary source of energy for New Zealand. As this cutting from 1958 indicates, an atomic power plant in the North Island was considered to be more economic in some quarters, since hydroelectric required being transported from the south to the north. Samuel Marsden chipped in with his 2 pennies worth here, telling Kiwis a nuclear reactor in New Zealand was no longer an if, but a when. The search was rekindled in 1963 when the New Zealand Electricity Department mooted opening a nuclear power plant, in case you hadn't already guessed it by now, on New Zealand soil. All political parties supported the proposition, at least in principle. A provisional site was also pinpointed 100 kilometres north of Auckland. The bays and rolling hills of Kaipara were eyed for the plant. The switch was going to be pressed down in the mid-70s. What it would need though was uranium fuel. A second wave of exploration began in the 60s and was part funded by overseas mining consortiums wanting to get in on the ground floor. Besides the low quality, the prospectors now had 2 other headwinds to contend with going into the 60s. Firstly, the world was awash with uranium and the global price had tanked. Next, the Benmore Dam and the Cook Strait cable went live in 1965 with follow-up hydroelectric projects on the drawing board, the likes of A.V. Moore in 68 and Manapori in 1972. What would put the cobwash on any nuclear plant was hydro beat it to the gun and local extraction price versus the global price. Capitalism put the end to uranium mining and nuclear power plants in New Zealand, not tie-dyed hippies chaining themselves to dozers. Still, overseas demand was still there. A German company had a crack in the 70s, Mount Isa from Australia as well. Some of any of the finds was earmarked for local use by the government in any deals. But by 1980 the dream was over. In another high five to the free market, Maui Gas went online in 1979 and the Clyde Dam 1992. And by the end of the 80s, even had a significant commercial uranium deposit be found, nuclear energy was well and truly lumped in with nuclear weapons. The politics of nuclear power and the country's status as a nuclear-free zone in 1987 would have made it impossible to proceed. It was all over, Red Rover. Since 1996, prospecting for uranium has been banned in New Zealand. Now, let's just quickly back the truck up a sec. What say the original find was viable, was worth billions as predicted. The country would have grasped the opportunity undoubtedly with both hands. An interesting what-if to ponder. This isn't, by the way, the only video I've done about the stampede to find mineral wealth in New Zealand. Diamonds and rubies were said to exist in Fiordland, and plenty of explorers went hunting them, like Donald Sutherland. Links for his video to follow and down below. Hope you enjoyed this little number. By the way, could I interest you in a scoop of ice cream to finish off? Make it 2 scoops, eh? Bye for now.